Winter didn't ask permission. A woman with nothing left. A child who's learned not to ask. And one offer that could save them or cost them everything. This is a story about survival, and the moment a stranger changes the course of two lives. The wind cut through woodward like a blade. Not the kind that just lifted dust off the road, but the kind that got under your coat, scraped your skin raw, and made you wonder if maybe God had left this place a long time ago. Joanna Walker pulled her daughter tighter against her side, wrapping both arms around the girl's narrow shoulders. Leela didn't speak. She hadn't said much all morning. Her face was pale, lips dry. She just stared at the cold biscuit in her lap, like she might cry if she tried to take another bite. They sat on the steps outside a feed store, backs pressed against splintered wood, watching boots pass by in the orange-tinged dust. Men didn't look at them. Women looked and turned away. 2 days ago, someone had offered them day-old stew behind the bakery. Yesterday, someone spit near Joe's shoes. Today, there'd been nothing.
Just eat it slow,
Joe said gently, brushing the hair out of Leela's eyes.
It's the last for now. I'm not hungry,
the girl whispered.
You're lying. I'm tired of being hungry.
Joe had knocked on every door she dared, offered to clean floors, wash clothes, cook. She could mend shirts, tend to livestock, even birth calves. But every face in town wore the same tight-lipped reply. Joe didn't answer. She didn't have anything left to say that wouldn't crack her voice open. Her boots were splitting at the seams. Her fingers ached from cold and exhaustion, but it was the way Leela had stopped asking questions that scared her most.
Times are hard.
As if she didn't already know that. Someone laughed across the street, a thick, oily sound. A man on a porch leaned against a post, talking too loud. Joe turned her face away and pulled Leela's head into her coat. One more day. That's all she had left in her. Just one more day before the cold took them, or worse, before someone decided a woman alone was fair game.
Walker.
The voice startled her, not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. It was low, grounded. Like gravel soaked in whiskey and dust, she looked up. A man stood 5 feet away, hat shadowing a sun-dark face. Broad-shouldered. Older than her, maybe mid-30s, with lines around his mouth that didn't look like they came from smiling. His boots were worn, but his stance said confidence. Not the cocky kind, the quiet kind.
I heard you're new in town,
he said. Joe nodded, rising slightly.
We got in Sunday.
He studied her, not in a leering way. Just took her in, her coat too thin, Leela's cheeks hollow. The way Joe stood between him and the girl, one hand flexed like she might claw someone's eyes out if it came to it.
Name's Caleb Hart,
he said.
I run a ranch west of town, 5 miles. All right?
He didn't move, just adjusted his hat like considering his next sentence.
I lost my wife 2 years ago,
he said plainly.
Got a daughter, Emmy, 9. Hard-headed, smart as a whip, but she needs more than me. And the ranch, it's too big for one man to run proper. I need help. In the house, with her. With the land.
Joe's breath caught. She could feel it, that shift. That moment when something inside her wanted to lean forward. Then he said it.
I need a wife.
Caleb raised a hand. Everything in her froze.
Not like that. I mean real. Legal. I got a preacher who'll sign it. Nothing improper. You and the girl, food, roof, safety. In return, I get someone who can share the load. A partner.
Leela peeked up at him.
Do you have a real house?
His eyes softened at the girl's voice.
Got 4 walls, a big kitchen, a stove that works, and a bed with clean sheets. Got chickens too.
Joe felt her knees wobble. It was madness. A man she'd never met, marriage. But the sharp cold pressing against her ribs said another thing. Winter was here. Hope wasn't. Caleb dug in his coat, pulled out a silver dollar, and placed it in Joe's hand before she could protest.
Murphy's Cafe. Get the girl something hot. I'll be at the Mercantile for another hour loading supplies. If you want to see the ranch, come ride with me. Just a look. No pressure. No decisions tonight.
Joe. Then he tipped his hat and walked away. Joe stared after him, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel invisible. The stew burned her tongue, not because it was too hot, but because her body had forgotten what food was supposed to feel like. Leela devoured her own bowl like she thought someone might take it back. Joe sat stiff in the chair, staring out the cafe window. Caleb was across the street helping load sacks of grain. He moved like a man who'd never stopped working, shoulders like fence posts, hands calloused. This was crazy. But crazy wasn't the worst thing. Starving was. When Lila finished her stew, Joe cleaned her hands, straightened her hair, and told the girl they'd go for a ride. The wagon creaked along the dirt road as the sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the prairie. Lila fell asleep in Joe's lap, her head warm against Joe's chest. Caleb spoke now and then, pointing out distant windmills, a dry creek, the hills where deer sometimes gathered. His voice wasn't smooth, but it was steady. No lies, no promises that felt too shiny.
Why ask?
He kept his eyes on the road.
'Cause you held that girl like she was the only thing keeping you breathing. That kind of woman doesn't quit.
Stirred. She said nothing, but part of her cracked open. The ranch came into view like something out of someone else's memory. A real house, porch light glowing, smoke from the chimney, a dog barking somewhere, chickens scattered near the barn.
Mama, it smells like dinner.
It smelled like safety. They reached the steps just as the front door opened. A young girl barreled out.
Who's that? This is Mrs. Walker and her daughter. Guests.
Emmy stood barefoot, dress crooked, hair wild. She had her father's eyes, sharp, but curious.
Are you gonna be the new housekeeper?
She asked directly. Joe didn't flinch.
Just visiting. For now.
Calla did. Inside, the air was warmer than she expected. The furniture plain, walls bare. A photo on the mantel showed a woman with dark braids and a tired smile, Margaret, his wife. Her ghost still lived here. Joe felt the weight of silence press on her chest, until Emmy dragged Lila outside to show her the kittens in the barn. Joe looked at Caleb, standing quiet in the kitchen, hands curled loosely at his sides.
I need to think,
she said. He nodded.
You've got time.
She turned toward the stairs, heart thudding with something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the memory of it.
This ain't charity,
Caleb.
It's a chance, for both of us.
Caleb stood at the edge of the porch, waiting. The screen door creaked as Joanna stepped onto the porch, Lila's small hand gripping hers tighter than usual. The light spilling from the ranch house was warm but unfamiliar, like a stranger offering a blanket on a cold night, comforting, but not quite trustable yet.
The girls are out back. Emmy's showing her the barn cats,
he said.
You don't have to stay long. Just figured it's better to see it before you make any big decisions.
Joe nodded, still unsure what she was doing. Her body moved, but her mind trailed behind. Everything felt both too fast and too slow, like the last few days had stretched into years inside. The house smelled like wood smoke and soap, not sweet, not floral, just clean and lived in, the kind of scent that said somebody worked here, not that they were trying to impress anyone. She noticed the table, long, solid oak, had a place already set for 2 extra people.
You were expecting us?
She asked, surprised. Caleb shrugged.
Figured it's good to be prepared.
He pointed toward a hallway. That word, prepared, stuck with her. Nobody'd been prepared for her in a long time.
West room's back there. You don't have to stay the night, but it's warm, and the bed's clean. You're welcome to it.
Joe glanced at the doorway, then at the photo above the fireplace, the woman with braids, her eyes kind but tired. Margaret. The woman who came before her, and maybe never truly left.
I'll put our things down,
Joe said, brushing Lila's hair out of her face.
Then maybe we'll come out and meet the girls.
The room was small, but the sheets were crisp, folded tight. Lila kicked off her boots and flopped face first onto the bed with a deep sigh. Joe smiled at that. Kids were funny, always managing to fall asleep somewhere new, like hope could be found under any roof. After settling Lila in, Joe returned to the kitchen. Caleb had started supper, bacon, beans, and something in a cast iron skillet that smelled halfway decent. He moved with quiet confidence, sleeves rolled up, hands efficient. He wasn't showing off, he was just doing what needed to be done.
I cook,
he said as he poured 2 mugs of coffee.
Not well, but enough to keep from starving.
Joe took the cup, wrapping her hands around the warmth.
It smells better than anything I've had in weeks.
Caleb finally broke it. They sat at the table, not facing each other, but angled like 2 people who'd learned not to take up too much space in the world. Silence stretched between them, not awkward.
I'm not the kind of man who says things fancy, so I'll keep it plain. I lost Margaret 2 winters back. She and the baby, they didn't make it. Emmy's been my whole world since.
Joe's eyes softened. She understood the sound in his voice, the tight edge of someone who'd seen life tilt sideways and kept walking anyway.
I'm doing my best,
he continued.
But Emmy, she needs more than I can give alone. She needs someone who can braid her hair right, tell her when she's being too wild, teach her things I don't know. And this house, it's clean, but it's not a home.
Joe looked around. She could see it then, the little emptinesses, a bare wall where pictures should be, a shelf holding tools instead of books, a chair too stiff, unused.
You're offering marriage to a stranger,
she said, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't flinch.
People marry strangers all the time out here. It ain't about love at first sight. It's about whether 2 people can build something solid. I'm not asking for romance. I'm asking for partnership.
Joe set down her coffee and looked him in the eye.
Why me?
Caleb didn't blink.
'Cause when I saw you on that porch, holding that girl like nothing else mattered, I saw grit. Strength. Margaret had that too. Not in the way she looked. In the way she stood her ground.
The compliment landed like a small flame in Joe's chest, not romantic, but respectful, maybe even tender.
I should tell you something,
she said, her voice lowering.
My husband didn't just die, he was shot. He owed men money, men from Denver.
Caleb didn't ask questions, he just nodded slowly.
That explains the look in your eye. What look? Like you're waiting for trouble to knock on the door.
He leaned forward just enough, swallowed hard.
Well, out here, we answer doors with a shotgun. And we don't let the past walk in like it still owns you.
Just then, the back door banged open. Leela came running in, cheeks flushed. There it was again, that weightless honesty. No pity, no rescue. Just a hand held out at ground level.
Mama! Emmy says I can ride her pony tomorrow!
Behind her, Emmy appeared with muddy boots and a gap-toothed grin.
She's not half bad at picking up kittens either.
Joe blinked fast, the way you do when you're not sure if something small and beautiful just cracked open inside you. Later, after both girls were upstairs and the fire in the hearth had burned low, Joe stood at the window, staring out into the prairie. Caleb was outside checking the barn, lantern swinging at his side. She watched him move like a man with weight in his bones but purpose in his stride. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from the quiet realization that she didn't feel scared here. Not exactly safe, but not scared. Behind her, the guest room was quiet. Leela was snoring softly. Maybe this place wasn't home, not yet, but it could be something. When Caleb stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him, he glanced at her.
You don't have to decide tonight,
he said.
I know.
But she already felt the wind changing.
You can sleep safe tonight,
said.
But by morning, you'll need to decide who you are.
Morning came quiet and gold. Joanna woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon drifting up from downstairs. For a moment, she didn't move. The bed was warm. The sheets smelled like sun-dried cotton. Leela lay curled beside her, still breathing deep and slow. It was the first time in months Joe had slept through the night without jerking awake. She stretched, rose quietly, and dressed in the gray light. Her body ached in familiar places, hips, back, shoulders. But it was the kind of ache that came from rest finally catching up to weariness. When she stepped into the kitchen, Caleb was already at the stove, flipping bacon with the kind of ease that only came from repetition. Emmy sat at the table, bare feet swinging, hair wild from sleep.
Morning,
Caleb said without turning.
Morning.
She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching as the 2 girls, Emmy and Leela, started whispering between bites. They were already becoming a pair, mismatched, curious, like a spark and a pile of kindling waiting to catch. After breakfast, Joe stepped outside to sweep the porch. The breeze was light today, but the red dirt still clung to every surface like it belonged there more than she did. She was halfway through the front steps when she heard it. The sharp, distant thud of hooves, fast, urgent, too many for it to be casual travel. Her heart stuttered. She dropped the broom and stepped down into the yard. Caleb was already walking out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, brow furrowing as he listened. 3 horses crested the hill, kicking up dust behind them. Men, armed. Joe's breath caught. Caleb moved toward her. Not rushing, just positioning. He stood just ahead of her, right hand hovering near his belt where the Colt .45 rested in its worn holster. The horses slowed to a trot as they reached the gate. The lead rider was thin, hawk-faced, and wore a black coat despite the heat. His eyes were cold, scanning the yard like a man used to being obeyed. The other two looked worse, heavier, sloppier, guns visible and slung low.
"We're looking for a woman named Joanna Walker,"
the lead rider said. Joe stiffened behind Caleb.
"Why?"
Caleb asked.
"She's got debts. Left Denver with money owed to the wrong kind of man. We're here on Morrison's behalf."
Caleb's voice didn't change.
"You're not in Denver now. She's running." "No, sir."
Caleb.
"She's married."
The man snorted.
"Married to who?" "To me."
The riders shifted. One of them spit in the dirt. The lead man narrowed his eyes.
"You got papers to prove that. Filed with Reverend Dorsey yesterday. Legal and witnessed."
Joe felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't speak.
"That debt doesn't vanish,"
the man said.
"In Oklahoma territory,"
Caleb said, slow and sure.
"A woman's debt don't follow her into a lawful marriage. You know the law, or you wouldn't be asking."
Silence. The air grew tight. Joe saw Emmy step out of the house, Leela right behind her. Both girls stayed quiet, but their eyes were wide. Behind the bunkhouse, Abner stepped into view, rifle slung casual over one shoulder, his expression unreadable but steady. The lead rider finally clicked his tongue and pulled the reins.
"We'll be back,"
he said.
"Gonna check your papers." "You do that,"
Caleb replied, not moving. Caleb turned slowly. The riders wheeled around, kicked up a cloud of red dust, and rode off the way they came. Joe let out a shaky breath only when the sound of hooves disappeared behind the hills.
"You all right?"
She nodded, even though her legs weren't sure about it.
"They'll be back,"
she said.
"Let 'em,"
he replied.
"We got nothing to hide."
She hesitated, then stepped inside. But she saw the flicker in his jaw, the tightness behind his eyes. He hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Neither had she. Later, inside, Joe sat at the edge of the bed, rubbing her hands together like she could scrub the memory of that man's eyes off her skin. She heard a knock at the doorframe. It was Emmy.
"Those men, they were after you."
Emmy's voice dropped.
"You gonna leave now?" "No, sweetheart. Not unless we're made to."
The girl's jaw worked like she wanted to say something more, but she just nodded and backed away. That evening, Joe found Leela curled beneath the kitchen table, small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She got down on her knees and crawled in beside her.
"They're gonna take us away,"
Leela whispered.
"No,"
Joe said.
"Not as long as we're here."
The words came out before she even thought them through. But saying them felt right.
"Caleb won't let that happen. Neither will I."
Leela didn't answer, but she leaned into her mother's arms and stayed there until the fear began to ease. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the prairie in dusty orange. Caleb walked the fence line with a lantern, the small light bobbing against the darkening sky. He did that every night, Joe noticed now. Not for the land. For them. For the house. For the idea of family, even if they hadn't called it that yet. She stood at the window long after the girls were asleep, watching the dark roll over the hills like a wave. Her past was still out there, riding horses, carrying names she didn't want to hear again. But this house, this man, this life felt like something worth protecting. Something she'd fight for next time.
"Next time they come,"
Joe whispered.
"I won't be the one hiding behind the door."
No dress, no flowers. Just 2 names on a church ledger and a quiet. The wedding was done by noon the next day.
"Amen,"
from Reverend Dorsey while the girls fidgeted beside them in their Sunday best. Emmy looked half bored, half curious. Leela clung to Joe's hand like the earth might shake again. Joe had stood there in boots still caked with dirt from yesterday's scare, hands trembling only once when she said, "I do." Caleb didn't smile. He just nodded once, like sealing a contract he intended to keep with his life. He nodded as she approached. There was no kiss, just a nod, a handshake from the Reverend, and a ride back in the wagon under the open sky. The prairie looked wider than usual that afternoon, not because of fear anymore, but because of what might come next. A future too big to see all at once. When they got back to the ranch, Caleb lifted Leela out of the wagon like she was his own, then handed Joe down without a word. But his hand lingered on hers a second longer than necessary. They didn't speak of the marriage again that day. Instead, Joe rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The kitchen had become hers by evening, not by force, not by request. It just happened. She scrubbed the counter, rearranged the shelves, folded towels the way she liked. Caleb didn't object. He just watched from the doorway and nodded once when she asked where the flour was. By the time supper was done, the girls had set the table, and a warmth had settled into the house like it had been waiting months for permission to return. Later that night, when the dishes were done and Leela had fallen asleep curled next to Emmy with a kitten tucked under her arm, Joe stepped out onto the back porch. The stars were brilliant out here, not like the city, not dulled by smoke or distance. They looked like they were watching. She heard movement to her right. Abner Reed was sitting on the fence post between their properties, pipe lit, rifle leaning beside him like it had never left his side. Joe walked over slowly.
"Quiet night?" "Best,"
she replied. They stood in silence a while before he said,
"Saw the preacher's wagon leave earlier."
"No."
"So it's official?" "It is."
Abner puffed his pipe, studying the stars like they'd answer something he didn't want to ask out loud.
"You trust him?"
Joe hesitated.
"I trust what I see." "That's a start."
He tapped out the ash.
"You know how to shoot?" "No."
"Want to?" She looked at him. He wasn't smiling, wasn't being polite, just offering knowledge like he'd offer bread to a starving man.
"Yes,"
she said.
"I do."
They started at dawn the next day. Abner brought out an old Remington and set up cans along the fence line. Joe held the gun with both hands, stiff, unfamiliar. Her arms shook after the first shot, but she didn't flinch. The second shot missed. The third nicked the edge.
"Don't just aim,
Abner.
Feel it, like you're already protecting someone."
Joe adjusted her stance. The fourth shot hit dead center. She lowered the rifle slowly, breathing hard. Abner said nothing, just handed her a fresh round. By mid-A, she could reload without looking. That afternoon, Joe cleaned out the spare room Margaret once used to sew in. Dust covered everything. A broken loom sat in the corner. She swept the floor, opened the window, and let the air in. Later she made cornbread, not the kind from a box, but from memory. With buttermilk and bacon grease and salt she could measure with her fingers. Emmy ate 3 slices before Joe could blink. At night, Caleb passed her in the hallway, pausing for a second.
"House smells good,"
he said.
"It's just cornbread."
He gave a slow smile, not wide, not long, but real. She didn't smile back, but her chest felt tight in a new way. They didn't share a room. Joe took the guest room. Caleb stayed in his. It wasn't awkward. It was understood, like waiting for a wound to scab before testing the skin underneath. A few days passed like that. Simple, steady. Then one morning, Joe found Caleb fixing a hinge on the barn door while Leela sat beside him watching.
"You always fix things yourself?"
she asked, leaning on the gate.
"Try to,"
he said.
"But not afraid to ask when I need help."
She walked over and picked up the second hinge.
"Looks like you need help now."
He chuckled, wiped sweat from his brow, and handed her a screwdriver. They worked in silence, comfortable, like 2 people who'd been doing it for years without needing to talk about it. When they finished, they both stood back, admiring the way the door hung straight now.
"You've got a good eye,"
he said.
"Comes from watching everything fall apart."
He looked at her then, really looked, not past her, not around her.
"Joe, you ever think about what comes after survival?"
He nodded toward the barn, the house behind it, the girls laughing near the stream. She blinked.
"Because I think we might be standing in it."
Her voice caught before she could answer. That night, she found herself walking the hallway again. Past the girls' room, past the fireplace where Margaret's photo still sat, past Caleb's door. She stopped in front of it, then turned and walked back to her own room. Not yet, but close. The next day Caleb was out at the far field fixing fence posts. Joe saddled the smaller mare and rode out to bring him water. She watched from a distance as he lifted a post into place, sweat soaking his shirt, arms roped with tension. He worked like the land belonged to him, or maybe the other way around. She rode up slow.
"You always do the hard parts yourself?"
she asked. He he grinned.
Only until you show up.
They drank water in the shade of the only tree for a mile. Birds chattered above them. The sky stretched forever.
You ever miss her?
Joe asked quietly. Caleb didn't answer right away. Then,
I miss who she was to Emmy. And to this place. But missing ain't the same as being stuck.
Joe looked down at her hands.
I still dream about Denver, not the place. The mistakes.
He nodded.
We all carry ghosts. The trick is not letting them drive.
She swallowed.
I think I want to stay. Not because I have to, but because I want to.
He looked at her steady.
You sure? Not about everything, but about you, yes.
They didn't touch, they didn't kiss, but something passed between them like heat from a long smoldering fire. A quiet understanding, a promise without words. As they rode back toward the ranch, Joe saw the porch light flicker on in the distance, and the girls waving from the fence. And for the first time in a long time, her heart didn't ache. It reached.
Joe stood in the doorway, heart pounding, and realized, I'm falling for a man I don't even know how to love.
The first rumor reached the ranch before the week was out. It came by way of Miss Tilly, Caleb's elderly neighbor to the east, who showed up unannounced with a basket of cornbread and a mouthful of polite venom.
I figured you'd want to know,
she said, placing the basket on the kitchen table without waiting for an invitation.
Some of the folks in town been whisperin' that Mr. Hart's new wife might not be all she seems.
Joe stood near the sink, drying a plate, heart suddenly heavy.
What are they saying?
Miss Tilly gave a tight smile.
Oh, you know how people talk. That maybe you ran from something, or someone. That maybe Caleb got tricked by a pretty face and a sad story.
Joe felt her jaw lock.
Don't let it worry you, dear.
Tilly added sweetly, tapping the lid of the basket.
This town always takes its time warming to newcomers. Especially the kind that marry fast and don't look back.
Joe thanked her politely but coldly. When the woman finally left, the kitchen felt tighter, smaller. Like the walls themselves had heard it all. That evening, she didn't mention the visit. Caleb worked late outside. The girls were already half asleep on the floor with kittens on their laps. Joe cleaned the same dish 3 times. By the third scrub, her hands shook. The next morning started loud. Sarah Morrison, daughter of Henry Morrison, who ran cattle and poisoned both, pushed Lilo into the mud behind the schoolhouse. Joe wasn't there to see it. Emmy was. By the time the teacher separated them, Emmy had torn a sleeve and Lila's face was flushed red with anger. Sarah had run off crying with mud in her hair and half a sandwich stuffed in her collar. The schoolmarm sent a note home pinned to Emmy's dress. Joe read it twice, then sat on the porch with the girls.
You want to tell me what happened?
She asked.
She called Mama a liar.
Lila said, arms crossed.
Said she trapped Caleb and doesn't belong here.
Emmy lifted her chin.
So I hit her. You what? She shoved Lila first. And then I shoved her back.
Joked her Lila.
I dumped her lunch on her head.
Added. Caleb appeared in the doorway, arms folded. Despite herself, Joe laughed, a short, shocked sound that burst out before she could catch it.
Sounds like I missed quite a show.
His voice was stern, but his eyes were fighting back a smile.
You girls know better than to fight,
he said. Joe looked at him.
Sometimes it is.
He raised an eyebrow.
Violence. Sometimes it is.
Joe repeated softly, looking at both girls. Then she leaned down and kissed their foreheads.
Thank you for defending me.
The girls beamed. Joe stood and walked inside, her face calm, but her chest burned with something sharp and hollow. Later that evening, Joe found herself in the barn. The sun had dropped low, casting gold light through the slats. Caleb was brushing down one of the mares. He didn't look up when she walked in, just kept moving the brush in slow, practiced strokes.
I heard what happened,
he said. Joe leaned against the post.
Did they call you a fool too, or just me? They called me worse when I married Margaret, he said. Same folks now pretend she was a saint.
Silence settled between them.
I know how it looks,
Joe said, voice low.
Marrying fast, no kin, a past I haven't spoken much about. I don't care how it looks. You should.
He stopped brushing, turned to face her.
You think I don't know what people are saying? I do. but I don't live for town talk.
Joe folded her arm.
That's easy to say when it ain't your name gettin' dragged.
He stepped closer.
It is my name, yours too now.
She stared at him, throat tight.
I didn't come here for pity,
she said.
I didn't come to be someone's burden or scandal. You didn't,
he said quietly.
You came to survive. It's more than that now. Then say it.
She bit her lip.
I want to stay, not just in this house, in this life with you, with the girls. I want to earn my place here. You already have.
She looked away, voice shaking.
But I'm still scared. Still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like happiness is a trick and I'm too dumb to see it.
He reached out, gently took her hand.
You ain't dumb, Joe. You're brave. Brave enough to keep going when everything's tried to break you.
She blinked hard, eyes stinging.
I don't need perfect,
he said.
I just need real.
She stepped into him slowly, leaned her forehead against his chest. His hand came up around her back, resting gently like he wasn't sure he was allowed to hold her yet. She didn't pull away. For the first time, she didn't want to. That night, after the girls were asleep, Joe sat by the fire with her sewing, patching a tear in Caleb's work shirt. He came in from the barn late, smelled like hay and smoke. He sat across from her, quiet.
I used to think peace was silence,
she said.
Now I think it's this.
He nodded.
This is the loudest quiet I've ever loved.
Then he said. They didn't speak for a while. Just let the fire crackle and the evening stretch out around them.
Do you ever think about what's next?
Joe looked up.
All the time.
He hesitated.
You ever think about love?
She smiled slightly.
I think I'm startin' to remember what it feels like.
Caleb's face softened.
Good.
He stood, stretched, and headed down the hall. She stayed by the fire until the embers turned to red, glow ash. Then she whispered into the empty room.
I didn't come here to be saved,
Joe said.
I came here to fight.
That night, the wind outside shifted. Not strong, not loud, just enough to stir the dust on the windowsill. Joe went to bed with her arms wrapped around Leela, who had crawled in sometime after midnight. In her sleep, Leela mumbled something about Emmy and a kitten that got lost in the barn. Joe smiled. She didn't dream of Denver. She dreamed of fence posts, Sunday stew, soft dirt on her bare feet. In the distance beyond the fence line, the coyotes cried. But inside the house, everything was still. The dogs started barking just before dawn. Joe was already awake. Something had pulled her from sleep, not sound exactly, but a feeling, like the air had turned heavier in the night. She slipped from bed without waking Leela, pulled on her coat, and met Caleb at the porch just as he was lighting the lantern. The sky was still black, the wind still, but the dogs weren't wrong.
I'll check the pens,
Caleb said, already heading toward the barn. Joe followed. They found the gate open and two of the ranch hands out of breath, spooked.
They got in quiet,
one said.
Cut through the back fence. Took 30 head, maybe more.
Caleb didn't curse, didn't raise his voice, just turned and started toward the tack room. Joe's stomach dropped. Rustlers.
Saddle up, they've got a head start, but not by much. You ain't going alone,
Joe said behind him. He turned.
This ain't your fight. The hell it ain't.
Caleb hesitated. She was already reaching for the rifle.
You said I was your partner,
she said.
Let me be.
His jaw tightened, not with anger, with fear. But he nodded. They rode out just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the hills red and gold. Joe kept close behind Caleb, heart pounding with every hoofbeat. Not from fear, not exactly, but from knowing the old Joe would have stayed behind, watched the smoke rise in silence. This Joe rode with a gun across her lap and resolve in her chest. The trail was easy enough to follow, cattle tracks, boot prints, a few cigarette butts crushed into the dirt.
They're moving fast,
Caleb muttered.
But slop.
They caught up just past midday, on the edge of a dried-out ravine. 4 men, all armed, herding cattle south through a rocky pass. Caleb pulled up behind a ridge. Joe slid off her horse and crept beside him, rifle in hand.
What's the play? She whispered. We flank. Spook the herd from 2 sides. Scatter their formation. They'll panic, lose control. You shoot if you have to, but only if.
Joe nodded. The world narrowed. Dust in her mouth, sun on her face, the sound of hooves and shouting below. They split. Joe slid down the slope, eyes locked on the rustlers. Then one saw her. He raised his gun. She didn't think. She fired. The man's hat flew clean off, and he tumbled backward stunned. Didn't get back up. The others scattered. Caleb charged from the other side, yelling like thunder. One rustler ran. Another tried to grab the reins of a steer and got kicked square in the chest. The last man dropped his weapon and raised his hands.
"We don't want no trouble,"
he stammered.
"You already found it,"
Caleb said coldly, disarming him. It was over in seconds. But Joe's hands kept shaking for minutes. Caleb met her eyes across the dirt-stirred chaos. There was pride in his face, respect, and something else, something fierce and private. When they rounded up what cattle they could and bound the 3 surviving thieves, Joe mounted her horse in silence. Her legs trembled, but her grip was steady. The ride back was long, quiet. Exhausted, they reached the ranch by sunset, cattle trailing behind like ghosts in the dust. Emmy and Leela came running from the house, faces pale until they saw Joe in the saddle unharmed. Joe slid down and dropped to one knee as Leela barreled into her.
"You came back,"
the girl whispered.
"Always,"
Joe said, hugging her close. Caleb dismounted slower, stretching his back. His hands trembled not from exhaustion, but from what hadn't been said. Joe walked over to him. Their eyes met.
"You all right?"
he asked. She nodded.
"You scared me half to death. I scared myself,"
she said. He gave a small, breathless laugh. Then he reached out and touched her face, calloused fingers brushing dirt from her cheek.
"Joanna,"
he said, voice rough.
"You're not just my wife."
She swallowed hard.
"You're my partner."
She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, just for a moment. Just long enough for both of them to breathe. That night, Joe sat on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the fireflies blink in the tall grass. Her body ached, but her heart was still racing in that way it does when something big has shifted, when you realize you're no longer surviving, you're living. Caleb joined her with 2 mugs of coffee. He sat close, their knees touching.
"You were something else out there,"
he said.
"I was scared,"
she admitted.
"But steady."
She took the coffee and looked out into the dark.
"I don't want to be afraid anymore,"
she whispered.
"Of men, of the past, of what's next." "You don't have to be,"
he said.
"Not here."
Then he turned, hesitated, and said, silence passed between them, full of meaning.
"Joe, I need to know something."
She looked at him.
"Was this ever just survival for you, or was it more?"
Joe didn't answer right away. She set her coffee down, turned toward him, and took his hand in both of hers.
"When those men came,"
she said,
"and you stood in front of me like I was worth protecting. When Emmy defended Lila, when Leela said we were safe, I knew." "Knew what?" "That this is home."
Caleb's breath caught.
"I know I came here desperate,"
she continued.
"But now, I choose this. I choose you."
He stared at her like he couldn't quite believe it. Then he pulled her in slow, careful, and kissed her. Not like a man taking something, like a man receiving a gift he thought he'd never have again. Her fingers curled in his shirt. His hand cradled her neck. And the world stilled.
Caleb looked at her, dirt on her face, rifle in hand, and whispered, "You're not just my wife. You're my partner."
The first hint came with the smell of bacon. Joe stood in the kitchen, pan in one hand, the other pressed to her mouth as a wave of nausea rolled through her like a dust storm. She set the pan down quickly, bracing herself against the counter.
"Ma."
Leela's voice was sleepy behind her. Joe straightened, wiped her mouth, and forced a smile.
"Just the smoke, honey. Go get Emmy. Breakfast almost ready."
But it wasn't the smoke. She knew it before she let herself say it. She was late. Not by much, but enough. And that tight ache in her chest, the spinning in her gut, the way the smell of coffee turned her stomach, it all added up. She was pregnant. The thought hit her with a strange stillness. Not fear. Not even shock. Just a quiet kind of awe. She placed a hand on her belly, flat and unchanged, and closed her eyes for a moment. This wasn't a mistake. It was life again after so much death. The ranch changed with the season. Spring came like a promise, soft rains, green shoots in the garden beds, new foals stumbling through the fields on awkward legs. Joe moved slower now. Not enough for the girls to notice, but Caleb saw it. He watched her closely, always with a furrow in his brow he didn't know he wore.
"You all right?"
he asked one afternoon while she was hanging sheets on the line. She turned a clothespin between her lips and nodded. He wasn't convinced. That night, she told him. They were sitting on the porch after supper, watching Emmy and Leela chase fireflies barefoot through the high grass.
"I'm late,"
she said. He looked at her, confused for a second. Then realization dawned in his eyes. He didn't speak, just sat there blinking.
"You okay?"
she asked gently. He exhaled long and quiet.
"Yeah, just didn't expect to feel like this." "Like what?" "Like maybe I get another shot."
Joe reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. Instead, he lifted her fingers to his lips. Abner came by the next morning with a saddlebag full of biscuits and news.
"My boy wrote me,"
he said, sipping coffee in the shade.
"Says he's setting up a little store near Tulsa. Wants me to come live close. Help raise his boys." "You thinking about going?" "Yeah, thinking hard."
He looked around the porch.
"This place is in good hands now."
She went still.
"You're leaving?"
she asked.
"Old men don't settle forever,"
he said.
"We just pause a while where it's quiet."
She swallowed.
"I don't know how to say goodbye." "You don't. You just say thank you."
He stood, slower than he used to, and placed a folded note in her palm.
"Read it when you're ready."
Then he tipped his hat and walked away without looking back. Joe didn't read the letter until nightfall. She sat by the hearth fire low, girls asleep upstairs. The note was short.
"You are more than what hurt you. Don't forget that."
Abner, she pressed the paper to her chest and let herself cry. Not from sorrow, from something else. Something that felt like letting go. Weeks passed. Caleb cleared space in the spare room, dragged an old crib from the attic, and started sanding the rails. Joe sewed tiny blankets from worn shirts. The girls argued over names. Emmy insisted it had to be strong. Leela wanted it to sound like spring. The house filled with sound. Real living sound, not just laughter, but footsteps, slammed doors, humming in the kitchen. A rhythm that said, "This is a family now." Joe found herself humming too. She took longer walks. Watched the sky more, smiled without meaning to. The fear didn't vanish, but it softened, like a scar faded by sun and time. One Sunday morning, they dressed in their best and rode into town together. The townsfolk looked. Some nodded. A few smiled. Nobody whispered. Not anymore. After church, Caleb placed his hand gently on her lower back as they walked to the wagon. She glanced at him.
"You all right?"
he asked.
"I'm not used to peace,"
she said. He smiled.
"Then let's practice it."
One warm evening, Joe stood barefoot in the garden, dirt between her toes, one hand resting on her growing belly. Caleb was fixing a hinge on the barn. Emmy and Leela were shrieking with laughter, chasing each other in circles with wild hair and glowing cheeks. She watched them with a soft smile.
"You made this house a home,"
Caleb said as he approached, wiping his hands. Joe turned to him.
"No,"
she said.
"We did."
He slipped his arms around her waist, kissed her cheek, and leaned his forehead against hers.
"I ever tell you how much I love you?"
he asked.
"Not yet." "Well,"
he said.
"I do."
That night, as the stars came out, Caleb asked. She kissed him once, gently, just as the girls ran past them yelling something about frogs. Joe laughed. She hadn't laughed like that in years.
"What do you think we should name the baby?"
She was quiet for a moment.
"Something strong,"
she said.
"Something that sounds like survival, like starting over."
He nodded. Together they watched the fireflies flicker across the yard. And Joe thought, for the first time since Denver, since the loss, since hunger and fear and shame, that maybe God hadn't left her after all. Maybe he'd just been waiting.
"You made this house a home,"
Caleb said. Joe smiled, hand on her belly.
"No,"
she said.
"We did."
The knock came just after lunch. Joe was peeling apples at the kitchen table, Leela and Emmy chasing each other in the yard outside, their laughter rising like birdsong through the open windows. Caleb had ridden into town early that morning to pick up a parcel of supplies. The baby in her belly had just kicked, strong, insistent, and Joe had smiled at the small, invisible miracle of it. Then came the knock. Hard, measured, a fist, not knuckles. She froze. Slowly she stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped onto the porch. Two men stood at the gate. She recognized one instantly, the thin, hawk-faced man from weeks ago, Morrison's man. The other was younger, bulkier, new. Both were armed.
"You need something?"
Jo asked, her voice steady. The hawk-faced man smiled without warmth.
"We've come for another look at that marriage certificate. Town clerk says it's real. Still, our boss isn't convinced. Says debt like yours don't disappear just 'cause you swap names."
Jo stepped off the porch, one hand on her growing belly, the other gripping the rail until her knuckles paled.
"That's not how the law works out here,"
she said.
"You know that. We don't follow the law,"
the younger man said.
"We follow Morrison. Then Morrison's gonna find out what happens when you push too far,"
said a voice behind them. Caleb, he'd come in quiet, from the back pasture, rifle in hand, boots dusty, face like carved stone. The two men turned. The younger one instinctively reached for his holster. Jo didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, placing herself between them and the girls still watching from the yard.
"You raised that gun,"
she said,
"and you'd better be ready to meet your maker."
The hawk-faced man spat into the dirt. Her voice was cold, clear. The man hesitated. Across the yard the ranch hands began appearing one by one, from the bunkhouse, from the barn, quiet, armed. Faces unreadable. It was clear now this was no longer a place to push.
"We'll tell Morrison he's not welcome." "Do that,
Caleb,
and tell him he's got no claim here. Not anymore."
She crouched beside her, heart clenching. The men mounted up and rode off without another word. Jo turned slowly, found Emmy and Leela still watching from the fence. She nodded once. It was over. That evening, the air smelled of rain that never came. Jo found Leela crying under the porch.
"What is it, baby?" "I thought they were gonna take you away,"
Leela whispered. Jo gathered her into her arms.
"No one's taken me anywhere. This is our home now. This is where we stay. You promise?" "I promise."
They sat there a long time, the girl pressed tight against her side, breathing slowing, heartbeat steadying. The next morning, Emmy stormed in from the dirt path behind the barn, dress stained, face flushed with fury.
"Sally Morrison said Mama's a cheat,"
she blurted.
"And that Papa only married her 'cause he was desperate."
Jo looked up from her coffee.
"What did you do?" "I pushed her,"
Emmy said.
"And Leela dumped water on her head."
Caleb appeared in the doorway, trying hard to look stern, failing.
"Girls,"
he said. Jo shook her head, trying not to laugh.
"You're both grounded." "But Mama." "No buts."
She reached across the table, took Emmy's hand.
"Thank you for defending our family."
Emmy's eyes sparkled.
"You are our family."
Jo had to look away to keep the tears from falling. Late that night, Jo found Caleb in the barn, brushing down the mare under the low lantern light. She stepped into the warm quiet and stood beside him.
"I've been thinking,"
she said. He didn't stop brushing.
"That always makes me nervous."
She smiled.
"About how this started. About what we've built since."
He looked at her then, soft and steady.
"You remember what I said, that first night?"
she asked.
"You said you needed time." "No."
She shook her head.
"I said I needed to decide who I was."
She took a deep breath.
"Well, I know now."
He waited.
"I'm your wife, not just in name, not just 'cause I needed a roof, but because I chose you, this life, these girls, this place."
Caleb swallowed hard. His hand found hers.
"I've loved you,"
he said.
"Since the day you looked at me like I was more than just the man I'd become."
She leaned into him. They didn't kiss, they just held on. Winter came fast. The baby arrived just after the first snowfall, during a night so still the trees outside didn't even whisper. It was a boy, red-faced, healthy, loud. Jo cried when she held him, not from pain, not from fear, but from something older than both: relief. Redemption, a second beginning. Caleb kissed her forehead, arms shaking, as if the weight of everything they'd been through had just found its place.
"What should we call him?"
he whispered. Jo looked at the boy's eyes wide, wondering.
"Call him Chance,"
she said.
"Because that's what we took. And that's what he is."
Caleb nodded.
Chance heart.
Spring returned with green in its hands. The ranch flourished, the girls grew tall and bold. The house filled with noise and music, and the garden out back bloomed brighter than any year before. One evening, Jo stood on the porch, Chance on her hip, watching Lila and Emmy chase fireflies through the dusk. Caleb stepped behind her, arms around her waist. They stood like that a while, silent, wrapped in the kind of peace people rarely talk about, not because it's small, but because it's earned.
Look at them,
she said.
Ivory Day. You think they'll remember all this? I hope so. But even if they don't,
he kissed her temple.
We will.
She nodded, smiling. The wind picked up then, soft, rust-colored, warm against her skin. The land was still hard, still wild, still full of things that might try to take more than they gave. But Jo wasn't afraid. She had stood between danger and her daughters. She had pulled a trigger. She had planted food in dry ground, sewn curtains, and buried the ghosts of another life. She had loved fully. She had chosen to stay. And she had become exactly the kind of woman she once thought had died in Denver. She pressed her cheek to Caleb's chest, listening to the rhythm of his breath, the weight of his presence. She didn't run anymore. This land was hers now, wild, hard, and full of love.